The necromancers of our favorite fantasy games and stories were based on a very real practice that tried to cross the boundaries between living and dead. This is the crazy history of necromancy explained.
Sorry, what is a necromancer?
Necromancer is someone who plucks the dead from the cold earth, breathes new life into them.
Necromancy, it turns out, wasn't originally about raising the dead at all. It would appear that the general term necromancy refers to any and all divination practices that involve the spirits of people who have passed on. The precise details of just what that includes has changed a lot over the course of centuries, but necromancy got its start when we began forming complex ideas about the afterlife. Once we believed spirits went somewhere, it wasn't that far-fetched to believe that if we just knew how to dial the celestial telephone, we could reach them. The idea goes back a long way. Shamanism, which predates Greek antiquity, involved practices where a shaman would enter a trance. Once in that state, the shaman would guide souls to the underworld, rescue the souls of the infirm, deliver messages to the dead, or ask them questions. It has long been believed that spirits have access to knowledge that the living don't. Ancient shamans could tap into the dead's wisdom to gain insight into what the spirits knew. It's also argued that necromancy's origins go back further still, to the Stone Age practice of ancestor worship. Religious beliefs that venerate the dead are among the oldest in the world. Rituals involving the remains of those who have passed on go back to the Neanderthals and to Jericho, with sites dated to between 7220 and 5850 BCE. Necromancers even got a mention in the Old Testament, specifically 1 Samuel chapter 28 verses 3 through 25. A medium is the focus of the story. She's called the Witch of Endor, and she's consulted by Saul, the first king of Israel. Even though Saul outlawed necromancy and communication with the dead, he asked her to use her talisman to summon the spirit of the prophet Samuel. He wanted to know the outcome of an upcoming battle against the Philistines, and it wasn't good news for Saul. The spirit told him that he and his sons would all die in battle, and Israel would fall. It's interesting to look at how this story evolved over the centuries. Originally, it was Saul at the center of the story, and the woman was referred to as either a necromancer, a sorceress, a pythonissa, a diviner, or a medium. It wasn't until the 15th century that images started to show her front and center, summoning the spirit of Samuel. And it was only in the 16th century that she was given the title witch. The narrative shifted from being about a king who wanted to know the future to the woman who could summon the dead to tell it to him. Necromancy was common throughout Greek myth, and it was dark stuff. Take the tale of Orpheus. Not only did he descend into the underworld to rescue his beloved Eurydice, but after his death, his decapitated head did some serious prophesying. The women of Thrace were responsible for the removal of his head, but even after the untimely separation, Orpheus's noggin continued to sing and speak. Eventually, his noggin ended up on the island of Lesbos. There it was discovered by the Muses and put into a cave. So many people came to consult Orpheus's head that Apollo got jealous and demanded that he stop. That's what's called skull necromancy. It's the practice of consulting the decapitated head of a person for some inside knowledge. Orpheus wasn't the only head that spent part of his afterlife giving prophecies as part of skull necromancy. Stockholm University says that Sparta's king Cleomenes was said to have kept the head of his friend Archonides in a jar, preserved in honey, brought out to be consulted on important matters.
Well, first, the good news. We're getting a couple of offers on the house you showed yesterday.
That's great.
Fantastic.
Magical texts from ancient Greece specify some of the ways the skulls were to be prepared in order to open up communication between the living and the dead. Pausanias of Sparta was credited with leading Greece to victory over Persia, but after the battle that kicked off the classical Age of Greece, he descended into tyrannical madness and a bit of treason. He headed to Byzantium, where he fell in love with a girl named Cleones. One night, she was brought to his chambers. The room was in darkness, and unfortunately for her, Cleones tripped and knocked over a lamp. This woke Pausanias from a tormented slumber, and he leapt up and killed her on the spot. But Cleones didn't leave. Her spirit continued to harass Pausanias. Desperate to rid himself from the haunting, Pausanias consulted with an oracle. It was revealed that Cleone's spirit would be at peace if only Pausanias returned to Sparta. Eager to be rid of the ghost, he went back. Unfortunately, Sparta was waiting to bring him up on treason charges, which they did, and in punishment, they bricked him up inside the wall of a temple. Greek oracles were consulted on matters of extreme importance, and one of the most famous was Apollo's oracle at Delphi. It was at Delphi where priestess Pythia gained access to Apollo's prophecies, but she wasn't the only oracle doing business. There was another oracle who dwelled at the top of a hill where 3 of the 5 rivers of Hades converged. Cocytus, the river of wailing, Acheron, the river of woe, and Paraphlegethon, the river of fire, met at a blighted land. And beneath the surface, in a ruined structure with walls 11 feet thick, sat the home of the Oracle of the Dead. It's a place spoken of in some detail in Herodotus's histories. And then there's the Necromantion of Ephyra, who was active around the 4th century BCE. Visitors who wanted to consult with the dead would descend into the subterranean chambers and perform rituals in order to open lines of communication. Just how legit the oracle was is up for debate. Archaeologists have uncovered mechanical devices believed to have been used to create the illusion that the rituals were working. Still, ancient texts suggest the oracle was incredibly popular. It was even the place where Odysseus was said to have summoned Tiresias to learn what the future had in store for him. Some ancient Greek sources say their necromantic knowledge came from the Middle East, and here's where things get extra surprising. Some figures, like Moses, warned against communing with the dead. However, those who were actually doing it really didn't see anything weird, creepy, or evil about it. The Magi held major sway in Egypt, the Middle East, and into India. They were widely respected and often consulted by rulers who wanted to know what the future held. And it makes sense. The souls of the dead were said to be closer to God and therefore had access to a wealth of information about the past, present, and future. The idea that the living could ask them about such things was perfectly normal. In Egypt, necromancers were associated with the cult of Osiris, and this is where it gets interesting. Today, we might think of necromancers as raising the dead, but in ancient Egypt, they were behind the rituals and incantations that prevented malevolent spirits from possessing a body and reanimating it. Meanwhile, the magicians of the Sabians were said to get their powers from their influence over the stars, and they turned that power into prophecy, conjuration, and necromancy. Necromancy underwent a major change in the Middle Ages, and starting in around the 13th century, it became much darker. A practice that had largely been written off as superstition started getting the attention of scholars across Western Europe who had begun to categorize magic. First, there was natural magic, described as active endeavors, where power was drawn from the world around the magician. Think of it as magical chemistry. While natural magic could coexist quite happily with Christianity, the other kind of magic couldn't. That was necromancy, which had grown from its original meaning to include black magic and anything that tried to control dark realms regular people weren't meant to know about. Basically, it came down to natural versus supernatural, and dabbling in the supernatural was something the church was vocally opposed to. The more Christian writers wrote on the subject of necromancy and other types of sorcery, the further from its original definition it got. Necromancers were suddenly almost unrecognizable from what they had been before.
Tremble then in the presence of the Necromancer!
Who?
It became a fusion of practices of different origins, including things like animal sacrifice, spells, exorcism, and astral magic. Along the way, the spirits that necromancers had been conjuring for generations took on a whole new aspect. They were confused and merged with demons, and suddenly necromancy was the darkest of dark arts. While Christian writers like Isidore and Thomas Aquinas were talking about how necromancers were busy summoning demons, actual necromantic texts were telling a completely different story. There isn't a single surviving necromantic text that says anything about making a pact with Satan, mocking God, or ridiculing Christianity. In fact, the opposite is true. At the core of a necromancer's power was the ability to command spirits to obey and answer them. That power, it was believed, came directly from God. The 14th century Catalan magician Berenguer Ganell wrote, "Magic is the art that teaches one to exercise coercive control over good and evil spirits through the name of God." Necromancers tended to hold a deeply profound belief in God and prepared for their rituals with fasting, prayer, and washing with holy water. Texts suggest that the general thought among necromancers was that they were something outside of good and evil. They were capable of achieving a holy state that spirits of all kinds had no choice but to obey. So, it shouldn't be entirely surprising that monks and clerics were among the foremost practitioners of necromancy, with alchemists, astrologers, and medical professionals close behind. Necromancers summon and speak to the spirits of the dead, but here's a question: why? Richard Kiekefer, a professor of religion studies and history at Northwestern University, believes that there are three main reasons for a necromancer to reach out to the great unknown. First, it could be to gain forbidden knowledge. Spirits, it was believed, could grant a summoner knowledge about the past, present, or future that they would otherwise never learn. That covers a wide range of things, from the outcome of a battle to uncovering the identity of a murderer.
How do you know my name?
I know absolutely everything, Frank. You see, I'm the ghost.
Second, there was a belief that spirits could aid in the manipulation of others. For example, in the Cantigas de Santa Maria, there's a song that tells the story of a priest who dabbled in necromancy in order to compel demons to force a young girl to fall in love with him. The demons complied, and the young girl succumbed to their power. But the Virgin Mary stepped in to save her and condemned the priest to hell. And third, there are the illusions. Necromancers were believed to have the ability to compel spirits to create illusions on a grand scale. Their powers allowed them to manifest everything from grand banquets to hordes of troops sweeping across battlefields. Some of the illusions were a bit more than just images, as there are more than a few stories of necromancers summoning mysterious black horses that could take them anywhere in the world. The necromantic rituals that are preserved in historical text suggest there were actually two parts to the act. Not only were rituals designed to summon the spirits of the dead or demons, but there were other practices like the drawing of circles that were solely to protect the necromancers from whatever they might end up summoning. Sometimes specifics got pretty dark. It wasn't unheard of to have a component of an animal sacrifice, but sacrifices were more along the lines of offerings like honey, milk, salt, or ash. Circles, which have long been believed to have protective powers, were common along with the inscription of astrological characters and the use of magic items like candles and swords. Spells were often recited, and strangely, these sometimes called out the names of Christian figures like Christ or involved reciting prayers or psalms. At least one form of ritual required an assistant, and that was prediction. Prediction was usually done with mirrors, glass, or liquids in a receptacle that formed a reflective surface. The images that would form on the surface could only be seen by a young virgin boy. Necromancy began to fade from history post-Renaissance, but it didn't so much disappear as it just sort of got rebranded. As history moved on from the Enlightenment to the Victorian era, people started to think differently about what happened to the dead and how they should be honored. That's also about the time the Fox sisters decided to make bank. Their house was haunted, it was said, and when mysterious noises started happening, that's when sisters Kate and Maggie Fox started claiming they'd been in contact with the spirit making the sounds. They called him Mr. Splitfoot, and it wasn't long before neighbors started asking them what was going on. The first time they demonstrated their abilities in public was on November 14, 1849. From there, it escalated into national tours and the development of spiritualism, which essentially involved holding a seance to summon spirits. Even though the whole thing was repeatedly debunked, the movement continued on well past what the Fox sisters had started. It's understandable, after all. The desire to speak to a loved one last time is a powerful thing. While things like the Ouija board and spiritualism have their roots in necromancy, there's also one entire religion that is based around the idea. That's Kimbanda. Kimbanda, which is practiced mostly in Brazil, has its roots in Africa. At the center of the religion are spirits called Eshus, Pombagira, and Ogum, which practitioners call upon during rituals known as trabalhos. The Eshus are a group of male spirits, and they're typically consulted by practitioners hoping to get otherworldly intervention in material matters. For instance, bringing someone to justice or signing business contracts. The female spirits are the collective known as the Pambajira, and they're typically called on to settle relationship issues. Often, they're asked to bring some good old-fashioned bad luck on arrival. The final spirit, Ogum, is associated with meditation and crossroads. Kimbanda rituals have similarities with medieval necromancy, and that they typically involve an offering, particularly rum for Eshus and beer for Ogum, along with food, flowers, and candles. The spirits are then asked for help according to specific rituals, which only the initiated are allowed to conduct. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about bizarre history are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.